Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Roman conquest of Britain. In Part 1, Kingdoms of Iron, we will talk about how after the Bronze Age collapse, new kingdoms emerged in Britain, ruled by warlike kings from hill forts who engaged in international trade, not just with the Celtic kingdoms in what is today France, but the great rising power of the Mediterranean, Rome. By the end of the Neolithic era, over 5,000 years ago, about 500,000 people lived in Britain. Their achievements were immense, including large-scale engineering projects, the development of farming, semi-permanent communities, and a rich religious life. Yet, as it must, the world changed. A new technology came from southern Europe. In what must have struck the first people to see it as magic, they saw the common metals of tin and copper transformed into something shiny and new and strong: bronze. Bronze not only made for better tools, but better weapons and armor. As the most successful Neolithic farmers expanded their wealth and social standing into political power, they used bronze as a weapon of war in expanding their holdings. Competition for land helped to turn Stone Age chieftains into Bronze Age warlords. And land didn't mean just food anymore, but wealth. Control of copper or tin deposits, or the trade routes used to move them from here to there, could make a chieftain rich. And ordinary folks could get involved too. Any merchant who could move copper and tin or amber from here to there could also become wealthier than any chieftain. However, the people of Britain would soon face a new nightmare which put their livelihoods quite literally underwater. Around the 1170s BC, a comet traveling near the Earth's atmosphere smothered the planet in a massive dust veil. Since the Neolithic farmers of Britain tended not to store food in great amounts, hunger set in immediately. They endured 18 summers without sunshine, along with torrential rainstorms that slashed their farmland. Villages inhabited for hundreds of years simply vanished from the map, and rain flooded miles of farmland, and some desperate farmers even built walkways to cross their flooded fields. Around the world, political upheaval became the bitter fruit of the Bronze Age collapse. Great states in China, Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean all but ceased to exist. The abject breakdown of the Bronze Age can be compared to the Dark Ages which followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, just as new kingdoms replaced fallen Rome, a new tool replaced bronze: iron. Iron likely started to be used around 1000 BC as a replacement for bronze, which could no longer be made because copper and tin were no longer traded. And sometime around 700 BC, iron making began to sweep across Europe, carried in by the Celts as they migrated from what is today Austria into Poland, France, and parts of Spain. Iron proved more durable and hard-using than bronze. After using iron-tipped plows, better grinding tools, and stronger sickles, farmers could make an acre of land that once fed 10 people in the Bronze Age feed 20 people in this new Iron Age. Suddenly, wealth could be thrown around again. In an age before money, success was something to be literally celebrated. Rich families and communities assembled gatherings of 200 or 300 people from many villages, in which they might slaughter 12 cows, 3 horses, sheep, pigs, dogs, and hares in a single extravagant feast planned years in advance and lasting for days. After the ceremonies and the ritual slaughter, they ate a huge meal in a grand gesture of excess designed to impress the neighbors and show them who was in charge. Indeed, the budding chiefs of the Iron Age expected those who ate at their feasts to do something for them in return. As the chiefs gained power, the islands became more densely populated, making it harder to walk away from ambitious strongmen or troublesome neighbors. These strongmen consolidated their power in hill forts, which could house hundreds of people. They ranged in size from small enclosures of less than half an acre to massive, multi-ditched sites. Hill forts also served as market towns, where local farmers could trade their surpluses to overseas merchants from goods from around the world. They were also places to go if you wanted to make contacts or look for a wife. Yet these hill forts, not surprisingly, also had a military purpose. They were surrounded by deep ditches and massive earthworks made from tens of tons of chalk and earth, meant to fend off large-scale invasion. A single entrance would be defended by a wooden gate with towers. The interior of a hill fort would include a rampart along with houses and storage sheds to help hold out in the event of a siege. Weavers, leather makers, and craftsmen lived cheek by jowl. And while the craftsmen who lived in the hill fort would enjoy the protection of the king, they would also be expected to mount the walls to help repel an enemy invasion. Indeed, the earthworks themselves were designed to force shield bearers to lift their shields as they marched, which left their legs vulnerable to javelins and arrows fired from the gate towers. Now, while the kings in the hill forts worried about expanding their kingdoms, most people in the workaday world found in the countryside worried a little more about putting food on the table. Most of these folks lived in the Round House, the domicile of Iron Age Britain carried over from the Bronze Age. Most of these houses would be linked together in a sickle-shaped chain, side by side, with family units divided up by interior walls. These houses, about 30 feet wide, were filled with bone utensils, pottery, and heaps of turf that served as beds. While some people kept making pilgrimages to Neolithic sites like Stonehenge, most people chose to set up sacred places within their own houses. Family and animals were buried in sacred corners of the houses. Most died naturally, but a few may have been sacrificed. Indeed, the roundness of the house was a reflection of the sun's shape. Around these houses one found fields, enclosed by banks and ditches, intended to keep the livestock in and the thieves out. Within these fields, people still grew wheat and barley, but in the colder and rainier climate of the Iron Age, grain and barley weren't quite as good as they used to be, because a good strong wind could easily blow kernels off the stalk. So more and more Iron Age farmers turned to things like peas and beans and onions that were closer to the ground and more likely to survive some rough weather. They also raised sheep, goats, and cattle, and any stock they couldn't feed through the winter, which usually meant most of them, were slaughtered to feed them through the cold months. Since iron could be produced relatively quickly and easily compared to bronze, violence simply became a fact of life for many in Iron Age Britain. Bronze had been produced in relatively smaller quantities, which gave kings more control over their kingdoms. But during the Iron Age, many men went around armed. Any powerful and ambitious landowner had the means to seek power at the expense of his fellow men. Men increasingly took the law into their own hands, whether it was a village chief leading the men folk on a cattle raid against another village, or kings leading their armies in wars against their rivals. Any man of status wore a sword, and if he ever felt that he suffered a slight to his honor, he would be thought a coward if he didn't pull out his sword and challenge the wrongdoer to a duel. Killing became something sacred in Iron Age Britain, almost part of their religion. The infamous bog bodies date from this era. People laid in bogs after being murdered in ritual or sacrificial killings. Murder victims would be taken into the bog with no clothes and then endure a triple murder. They would have the rope of a garrote tightened around their throat, and then their neck would be slit so the blood sprayed out in a great spurt, and then they would be laid face down in the water to drown. Indeed, the placing of slaughtered men in bogs recalls the Bronze Age practice of throwing goods into the water as a sacrifice, implying that these murder victims were indeed offerings to this god or that. In part because of frequent warfare and increasingly powerful loyalty to local strongmen, regional identities began to develop. Tribal nations with names like the Trinovantes, the Siluris, the Cornovi, and the Selgovae began to emerge. Britain was crisscrossed by frontiers between competing tribal kingdoms, and these nations would not have considered themselves Britons. Indeed, the name Britannia came not from the people who lived in Britain, but the Romans. However, some of these Briton kings began to copy the Romans by minting their own coins, and they often used the grand megaliths from the Neolithic era like Stonehenge, by then thousands of years old, to project an image of antiquity and power. Yet, could these kingdoms be called Celtic as they historically were? Writers in the 1700s labeled the British Iron Age kingdoms as Celtic. That would be a mistake. Admittedly, it is an easy mistake to make. The hill forts, artwork, chariots driven by the aristocrats, weapons, and jewelry all look extremely Celtic. Yet, does that mean that the Celts at some point overran and conquered Britain? This is likely not the case. In truth, Celtic ways spread into Britain through a process of cultural interchange, like the spread of Christianity during the early Middle Ages, or the spreading of Hellenistic Greek civilization during the age of Alexander. Indeed, this cultural interchange occurred in part because of frequent intermarriage between the great families of Britain and what is today France. In short, the Briton aristocracy took on some Celtic ways, but the Celts did not take Britain. Indeed, like their cousins on the continent, the Briton chieftains learned to ride chariots in wartime as a way to advertise their status, and collected heads to display outside their houses in the Celtic fashion. Yet they would not have considered themselves anything except a Trinovante or a Siluri or a Cornovi. And the kings of these early British kingdoms relished conspicuous consumption. This was financed by exports. And in Iron Age Britain, the most easily obtained trade good was people. During warfare, men, women, and children would be captured, shackled together by the neck with iron chains, and marched to the ports. After 150 BC, the British came into increasing contact with the Romans, and kings increasingly went to war simply for the purpose of obtaining slaves so that they could trade them for goods that allowed them to live like Romans. Slaves on the coast would be traded for colored glass, figs, fine wines, expensive spices, and perfumes to support the lifestyles of the ruling elite who enslaved their neighbors in order to finance their luxurious living. One Roman writer gleefully noted that some Britons would exchange a slave for an amphora of wine, and indeed this would only become the beginning of a longer interaction with Rome that ultimately ended with Britain becoming a Roman province. And we'll learn about that in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.